There were a number of volunteers from India who fought in the Spanish Civil War, and they were very diverse, much like you see foreign fighters in Ukraine today, or in a lot of other cases. So you had some people who were communists who went. You also had Hindu activists with the RSS. You had people who were not fighters. You had doctors who were Muslim. You had writers also, like Mulk Rajanan was one of the probably the most famous volunteer from India to go in Spain. I think Ukraine has done a very good job with the public relations aspect of the war so far. I think Ukraine has made it very clear that people will be welcomed, that they will be taken care of, that they would be part of the Ukrainian military, not just part of some armed group off on by itself. There's always somebody. There's always somebody you have to look out for. And so I know that there are a number of governments who are concerned about the people who are going. I know there's a case of an American who went about a week ago who had been involved in domestic extremism in the United States, was already on a watch list, but never had a passport before, but was able to get it and go to Ukraine despite this.
Namaste and welcome to Citti Media's Current Affairs Show. My name is Ratnadeep Chakraborty and I am your host for today. It's been reported that nearly 20,000 foreign nationals from 52 countries have joined the International Legion. The paramilitary force of volunteers has put together by President Zelensky's government to fight Russian forces. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor David Malet, Associate Professor of Justice, Law and Criminology, School of Public Affairs at the American University and specializing in the study of foreign fighters. David, you're very warm. Namaste and welcome to the show.
Namaste. Thank you. My pleasure.
How are you doing today?
Very well. How are you doing?
We're doing very fine in India, and I thought of having this conversation with you because this is one of the vastly understudied topic, and who is better to have this conversation than someone who has studied this topic for a very long period of time. So before we get into the detailed conversation on the current Ukrainian fighters, could you please give us a brief history of foreign fighters, especially how they have been recruited?
Well, I think we can learn a lot about what's happening in Ukraine right now if we look at the foreign fighters for different causes throughout history. And there are many of them. There are maybe hundreds of thousands of them. And we haven't studied them all together, I think, because there's a lot of attention that is paid to some very high profile cases like the jihadi groups, maybe one or two historical cases like Spain in the 1930s. You hear a lot of comparisons right now to volunteers in Ukraine being like the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, where you had the international brigades who were mostly communist, but were fighting for a democratically elected government in Spain against the fascist army. And I think that's a good comparison to start out with. There's actually, perhaps it's not known as well as it should be, but there were a number of volunteers from India who fought in the Spanish Civil War. And they were very diverse, much like you see foreign fighters in Ukraine today, or in a lot of other cases. So you had some people who were communists who went. You also had Hindu activists with the RSS. You had people who were not fighters. You had doctors who were Muslim. You had writers also, like Mulk Rajanan was one of the probably the most famous volunteer from India to go in Spain. And so they each had very different motives for going, but they responded to similar types of recruitment. And you know, these were not the only volunteers from India in past cases as well. There was in the Israeli War of Independence, around the same time as India's independence, you had a man go from Mumbai who was of Iraqi Jewish descent. You know, there was an ethnic cause in that case. And later, of course, you would have some people, very famous members of the jihadi movement as well in Al-Qaeda. There's a man known as Abu Abdel Aziz, who was originally from pre-independence Hyderabad, who ended up leading the Al-Qaeda forces in Bosnia and later became a financier for Lashkar-e-Taiba. So these seem to be people who are very different from each other, but there's actually some commonalities between them, despite the fact that they're for different causes and in different times in history. And what we see, and I think what we're seeing in Ukraine this week as well, is that a side that is the weaker side in a fight knows that it can't win by itself, so it looks for outside help. And sometimes it gets this help from foreign governments, but sometimes it has to find it from ordinary people. And so it tells them, don't worry about whatever country you're a citizen of. We share some common bond. We're the same ethnic group, we're the same religious group, we have the same ideology, and we're under a grave threat. They're coming for our people, they're destroying our people, and you have a duty to do something to help out. And sometimes they will use atrocity propaganda about women and children, and sometimes it's true, and sometimes they invent it. But it's always this message about we're losing and we need your help. Even when they're winning, they say that they're losing, and they're not mercenaries, because sometimes they're not paid. The volunteers in Ukraine right now are not being paid. And sometimes, you know, we think of people who joined ISIS and became suicide bombers. Obviously, they were not in it for the money. So a lot of times, regardless of the cause, they say that this is about self-defense, and you have to help us out now before it's too late, or they'll come where you live next. So it's up to you to stop that by fighting over here.
Yeah, and I wanted to. That's a very fascinating insight. Actually, I wasn't aware of Indians fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Actually, so that's a very fascinating aspect that you have actually shared with our audience. I wanted to understand about the basic push and pull factors actually for these fighters. Let's say the war in Afghanistan, or while they were joining the caliphate. So, what were the basic push and pull factors? I will come back to the Ukrainian foreign fighters in the next question, but I wanted to understand the basic push and pull factors for these foreign fighters.
Yeah, so the jihadi movement today with Al-Qaeda, with Islamic State, really starts in Afghanistan around the end of 1979 when Russia, the Soviet Union, invades. And the message to volunteers, it's very clear. It's raising money is not enough. We need people to come fight. And you had some Arab activists who had been very supportive of this theory that Muslims around the world needed to get involved, needed to fight back, take back land that was being taken from them. And so some of them were there at the beginning. They showed up almost immediately to say that it doesn't matter if they're a different ethnic group, if we're Arab and they're Afghan, they're fellow Muslims, no one is helping them. We have to stop these communists from destroying their lands. And this went actually on for the first half of the 1980s without a lot of success. It wasn't really until Osama bin Laden came with all of his money and began getting support in Saudi Arabia to fly people out on paid trips to make jihad that you started to get larger numbers. But even so, it was only a couple of hundred people. The Soviets didn't even know they were there. But they were convinced that they had defeated the Soviet Red Army. They were convinced that the Soviet Union collapsed because of them. And so when the war ended, a lot of them knew that because they had been involved in terrorism back in their Arab home countries, they were not going to be welcomed back. The idea was they were supposed to have been killed in Afghanistan, but they weren't. They survived. And they had nowhere to go. They were told they couldn't stay anymore. So they started to look for other places, and they looked for other wars like Afghanistan. Maybe there were communist armies or there were Muslim civilians. And so they went to different places like Chechnya, to the Philippines, to Algeria, Bosnia, all over the world. And they spread out from there, which is what I think makes the Muslim foreign fighters different than the past groups like the Spanish Civil War, is because in the past, the groups, they just went home. The governments let them back in. In this case of Spain, the League of Nations, before the United Nations, actually gave them money and facilitated their travel back to their home countries. So you had this sort of semi-professional group starting up because they had nowhere else to go. And so eventually 9/11 happens, they fight in Afghanistan for a while, but it becomes clear that Iraq is going to be the next big battleground. And many of them, knowing that the United States was going to Iraq, actually left Afghanistan to go to Iraq so they could fight the American army. And it really, they did well for a while because they made the same sort of defensive argument. They said, in this case, that they were Sunni, that Iraq Muslims, that Iraq was being taken over by Shia Muslims, who were the majority in Iraq, but had Saddam Hussein, the previous dictator, had been Sunni. So now they said, you know, we're here to defend Sunnis. Most of their targets were actually Shia Muslims in Iraq, government offices like Shia police stations, Shia mosques. And they did quite well for a while because they had a lot of disaffected people who were losing things under the new government in Iraq with them. But they made the same sort of rhetoric also that innocent people are being killed, that if you're a good Muslim, you have to fight back because nobody else is going to. It's been the same story. And they didn't have to start from the beginning because people had already been hearing the story for years because of previous activists who were still involved. So the Islamic State, they did very well for a few years in Iraq. Ultimately, the local population turned against them and began working with the US military to hunt them down. So there was quite a while where their fortunes were down before the conflict in Syria started. And in Syria, it was the same narrative. We're defending Sunni Muslims against the Shia Assad government. And this was the case where, because of Russian support for Assad, the international forces were not going to go. So they actually knew that they had an open place to operate where they could found their caliphate that went along with their plans for a number of years.
And I want to come back to that aspect a little bit, actually, because what we're seeing right now in Ukraine, nearly 20,000 people are volunteering for the International Legion for Territorial Defense of Ukraine. And the government has actually created a website for people to actually volunteer. And the interesting facet is when the ISIS was at peak between 2014 to 2019, around 40,000 people have traveled to join the caliphate. But in a shorter span, we're seeing over 20,000 people have joined Ukraine. So how do you perceive the situation, and how does the security community actually believe this will be a larger threat?
Yeah, if the numbers are accurate, it's an amazing figure that you would have so many so fast. It could be quick. I mean, the war was less than 3 years, and you had more than you had in the several years that went to Syria. So it's possible, especially now with internet enlistment, as you're mentioning, that maybe they all just joined immediately on the website. We don't have a good sense of the foreign fighter numbers. We have rough ideas of the numbers in all of these historical, because people don't do activities that are illegal. We have the Ukrainian government's report of 20,000. The numbers might be a little bit lower of the numbers who actually go. I saw one report that there have been thousands of Americans who've actually volunteered, who signed up through the website, but maybe only 100 have been accepted. And some have gone and been turned away by Ukraine because they actually don't have military skills. They just are people who wanted to help. And Ukraine said to do humanitarian work or something, which wasn't what they were there for. There are these noble causes that people sign up for, that the groups promote, but a lot of people, individuals, are sometimes just there for adventure personally. And if they can't get that, or they say, oh, there really isn't the kind of threat I thought there was, or they're not going to treat me well, which happens a lot also, sometimes they do just go home. So whether we actually get 20,000 foreign volunteers in Ukraine, I think is going to be a different story than 20,000 signing up through the website.
Yeah, and the interesting part is the way the world is perceiving this, and a lot of security experts who spent the last 2 decades sounding the alarm over foreign fighters in the case of a global jihad are lauding the commitments of actually non-state militant or military and civilians from countries like the US and UK who are willing to pick up arms for Ukraine actually in this war. And I wanted to understand what motivates this young students, let's say a 21-year-old student from the southern part of India actually, to fight against the Russian. When compared to the Islamic State, as you mentioning, there was a religious pull factor, and we have seen the internet chat rooms that radicalize people to join the caliphate. But why will suddenly 20,000 odd people, if the numbers are accurate, that's given by the Defense Ministry of Ukraine, from 52 countries, will actually join the Ukrainian forces?
I think Ukraine has done a very good job with the public relations aspect of the war so far. I think Ukraine has made it very clear that people will be welcomed, that they will be taken care of, that they would be part of the Ukrainian military, not just part of some armed group off on by itself. That it gives people a lot more security. It gives them a sense that they will not be left alone, that they'll be part of the official military forces. So I think that's part of the appeal. Another is the different reactions, as you mentioned, from the home countries. There's something you might argue of a double standard, saying that it's a threat to have any citizens go off to join any group in the Middle East. Some countries even prosecute citizens for went to go fight against ISIS as foreign fighters, saying anybody who went there is dangerous. We can't allow this. But some of these same governments, like Britain, are saying, well, it might be okay to go, and some of them are even directly telling their citizens, it's all right, we want you to go ahead. So there has definitely been a concern about Ukraine for some time now, because you've had the conflict with Russia started in 2014. And by some estimates, there have already been 20,000 volunteers going through, most of them on the Russian side, but maybe 2,000 volunteers on the Ukraine side before Russia invaded earlier this year. At least one of them is from India, who I've heard of previously. But as far away as from Brazil, Australia, really all over the world. And a lot of them were responding to, sometimes it was the Ukrainian message that Russia will not stop with Ukraine, it will be a threat to the West. Some of them, and I should say that there were extremists on both the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, but there have been some numbers of white supremacists, Nazi adherents, who say that this is a good opportunity for training to attack their home countries. There have been a couple of Americans in cases like that previously who have been, in some cases, arrested already after committing murders in the United States, who had already been to Ukraine. So there's a reason that people were already on the security watch list, which does make it surprising to me that their governments are now saying it's okay to go fight Russia. I think the conflict has been recast a little bit by the Russian invasion. It's no longer just far-right extremists who are maybe Nazis looking for training. It's now suddenly become, these are people defending Western order and maybe democracy against Russian attacks. There's always a political element to this.
And yeah, this is not the first time we have seen actually the American support to the Mujahideen against the Soviets in Afghanistan after 1979 and fighting the same people, or Russia's own position actually in Taliban after the US withdrawal. We have seen the international order actually shifting on multiple occasions. But I wanted to ask you a little more about the possible threats. Actually, you mentioned a couple of them. These foreign fighters might be posing when they return back to their host countries, or even travel to another conflict theater. One of the papers you wrote mentioned about that of foreign fighters not returning to their host countries but going to another conflict theater. So they're combat trained and they can potentially radicalize other people.
We see this happen with the jihadis, in particular. The man I mentioned, Abu Abdel Aziz, became one of these trainers. He started out, he was originally born in India, but he lived in Saudi Arabia, went to Afghanistan, then went to Bosnia, went to a few different places. And we see that most foreign fighters actually don't have very good careers. They are, they're used oftentimes as shock troops, as cannon fodder by the local rebel commanders, because they don't know who they are, and sometimes they don't have skills. They show up with nothing but good intentions, so they send them out first. But the ones that do survive, yeah, they gain respect, they gain experience, and they become leaders, even in countries where they've never been before. They're put in charge of groups because of their previous experience, and become sometimes the masterminds of terrorist plots. So that is definitely one danger, that some don't go home at all, that they become threats elsewhere. There's been concern about the ones who do go home, because there were some studies showing that some jihadis, maybe as many as 10%, could become domestic terrorists. We didn't see that happen with Syria. And maybe it's because security services were looking for them and were more active than they had been in the past. But if you look at all the different historical cases, there are extremists in all of these different wars for different causes. And there's always some who become involved in militant politics, who become involved in attacks at home or in another country. But most of them don't. Most of them, you never hear from them again. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that although there are some who stay loyal to these causes for decades and give money, give speeches, there are a lot of them who come back very disillusioned. They say that, this isn't the cause, this cause isn't what I thought it was, or I believe in the cause, but the group treated me badly, they lied a lot. So you see some people come back very disillusioned. You see other people coming back now from Syria to Southeast Asia, to Europe, with severe PTSD. And I don't know that we have any records of this from past cases like the Spanish Civil War, but I wouldn't be surprised, given the type of treatment that the foreign fighters receive is usually very poor, because they usually have casualties. Maybe 1 in 3 becomes a casualty. So I would expect to see that sort of problem for the people who go and for their families as well when they return. So I think there are different reasons why you don't see the threat, but there's always somebody. There's always somebody you have to look out for. And so I know that there are a number of governments who are concerned about the people who are going. I know there's a case of an American who went about a week ago who had been involved in domestic extremism in the United States, was already on a watch list, but never had a passport before, but was able to get it and go to Ukraine despite this. So I'm not sure if security services are all coordinating fully in every country about this potential threat, but I think this is an issue that is going to be very high on the security radar for years to come, no matter what happens in this war.
Yeah, and this is something which I've seen a lot of security commenters, security analysts actually commenting on this, that in fact, a paper written by Thomas Heckhammer and Peter Lessler actually mentioned that approximately only 1 in 360 returnees have actually perpetrated an attack after their return. And a lot of analysts have been believing that we are actually overplaying the situation. Actually, it's not as dangerous as it is. But on hindsight, do you think that it's a serious situation of actually civilians getting training, actually combat training, and coming back to their country?
I think there are always a few who do. I don't think it's worth changing the constitution, changing the laws like some countries. A lot of Commonwealth countries, I think, overreacted to ISIS. Britain, Australia, for a while, Canada and New Zealand changed their laws, to make it easy to strip people of their citizenship, which are not supposed to do under international law. They're still trying to do it in some cases to make people stateless, because they say it's too big of a threat to let anybody who's even gone to Syria, no matter which side they were on, come back. But yet some of these same governments are also encouraging their citizens now to go and fight in Ukraine. So yes, the fears of people becoming radicalized are real. The fears of them becoming a bigger threat, I'm not sure that we have evidence for that. If you look at probably the biggest foreign fighter returnee attack, the biggest attack by a returned foreign fighter from Syria would be the Paris attacks and the Brussels attacks. 2015, 2016, hundreds of people were killed. But these were shooting attacks, and it's not clear that anything was really added to the criminals who did it by having been in Syria. Could they have used these same sort of weapons if they had never been to Syria, if they'd just been domestic terrorists? Very likely. So, I think the biggest concern about going to Ukraine now or going to Afghanistan in the 1980s is that they're networking opportunities. They're the chance for these extremists from different parts of the world to compare notes, to exchange best practices, but also to get to know each other and build these networks. And that is really how Al-Qaeda began, with the volunteers in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And they began to cooperate with each other in the various countries and share resources. And so there's been a concern that this could happen on the extreme right with white supremacist groups in Ukraine. And some have called for this to use this as a training ground, to use this as an opportunity to prepare for attacks at home. So it remains to be seen if anything like that will happen, but the concern is already there.
So interestingly, you mentioned the case of Shamima Begum, who was actually found in Al-Rose prison camp in northeast Syria in 2019 and remains there almost 3 years on from Islamic State's military defeat. She was one of the interesting cases where she was stripped of her citizenship, and there is no indication of how long she'll be detained in the prison camp. And that opens up to this public debate of actually handling the returning Islamic extremists or foreign fighters, actually. So what are the legal challenges, actually, you think these foreign fighters might be posing, actually, when they return to their host countries? Because one, they have not committed any crime in their host countries. It's in a foreign country, and there is no way to actually legally vet the crimes they've committed.
It's very much dependent on what the country of origin of the foreign fighter says in their own laws. As far as international laws go, the United Nations passed some rules. And when Islamic State began to recruit in 2014, they created the foreign terrorist fighter designation, which only means members of Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, not any other jihadi group or any other place like Ukraine. And under international law, every country in the world is supposed to stop its citizens from going to become a foreign terrorist fighter, is supposed to bring, there shouldn't be a debate theory about and it's supposed to prosecute them. But it doesn't say for what, it doesn't say what the penalties are. It's really up to every individual country's laws. So some countries have found it easier to try to say, well, these simply aren't our citizens anymore. We've taken away their citizenship. We don't need to bring them back. But of course, this is what Saudi Arabia did with Osama bin Laden in the 1990s. So I think this approach is maybe short-sighted. I think it just makes a bigger problem down the road. There are some countries that have changed their laws. Countries like Indonesia actually said originally, well, we can't prosecute people for crimes that they've committed in Syria. And because of the international pressure related to ISIS, they changed the laws. And you have seen convictions in a number of countries, criminal convictions, for actions that people took in Syria based on evidence that they posted to social media or from other sources like that. So there is a range of options available to different countries. It's just, again, politics makes it easier sometimes. If you don't want to worry about a terrorist threat, you can simply say, we're not going to let them back in. But I think this actually creates a bigger problem because these people become the career foreign fighters who simply join another group and get more experience and launch bigger attacks.
Well, I think that's a fascinating aspect that you've shared with our viewers. And as you rightly mentioned in your book, that foreign fighters appeared in at least 26% of the civil wars in the past 200 years. And there is much that we can learn from the past to apply to the problems of today and tomorrow. And this influx of foreign fighters is a sign that we haven't learned much from our past. Will these foreign fighters pose a significant threat, or are they posing a significant threat at the moment? Is something that only time will tell. Well, thank you so much, David G, for taking your time and speaking to us. It's a real pleasure to host you for my first interview. And thank you for giving our audience a perspective of a vastly understanding topic at the moment. I look forward to having you to more such conversation in the future and hosting on a show.
Thank you, Radhadeep. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Namaste and have a great day ahead.
Sure.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net.